The auctioneer's hammer fell with a sickening thud that echoed through Mabel's soul. Sold for $30 to the Lumberjack. Her own father counted the coins with trembling hands, unable to meet her eyes. At 23, she stood on that wooden platform, not as a bride, but as discarded goods, barren, worthless, a daughter who had failed her most fundamental purpose. The crowd dispersed their whispers, cutting deeper than winter wind. Can't even give a man children. What good is she? But as tears blurred her vision, a gentle hand touched her shoulder. The silent lumberjack with kind eyes and calloused hands would change everything she thought she knew about family worth and the power of love that grows not from blood, but from choice. Stay with me through this heart-wrenching journey of redemption, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories of hope can travel across the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty marketplace of Cedar Falls, but for Mabel Hutchins, the world had already grown dark. She stood trembling on the wooden platform, her worn blue dress catching the autumn breeze as dozens of eyes scrutinized her like livestock at auction. The humiliation burned through her chest, a fire that threatened to consume what little dignity she had left. Now here we have Mabel Hutchins. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd, his tone clinical and detached. 23 years old, good health, can cook and clean. His voice faltered slightly before continuing. Though she's proven unable to fulfill a woman's primary duty. A murmur rippled through the gathered men. Some shook their heads in disappointment, others whispered among themselves. Mabel's cheeks burned crimson as she stared at her bare feet, her father's words from that morning echoing in her mind. You're no good to me, girl. Can't give a man children, can't bring honor to our name. At least this way you'll be someone else's burden. Thomas Hutchins stood at the edge of the platform, his weathered face a mask of grim determination. He had once been a proud man, a farmer who worked the land with his bare hands and dreamed of grandchildren playing in his fields. But 3 years of failed pregnancies, of watching his daughter's marriage crumble under the weight of unspoken blame, had hardened his heart into something cold and calculating. She's been married before, he called out to the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of resignation. Husband sent her back, said she was defective. The word hit Mabel like a physical blow, and she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces of her shattered soul together. A man in a worn brown coat stepped forward, his face twisted with cruel amusement. What use is a woman who can't bear children? He shouted. Might as well buy a milk cow, at least that'll give you something worthwhile. Laughter erupted from several corners of the crowd, each chuckle another nail in the coffin of Mabel's dignity. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's voice, the gentle woman who had died when Mabel was 15, taking with her all the warmth and love that had once filled their small farmhouse. Mama, she whispered under her breath, I don't know how to be strong anymore. The auctioneer raised his hand for silence. Let's start the bidding at $10. Do I hear 10? 5, someone called out from the back. That's all she's worth. 7, another voice added with obvious reluctance. Mabel felt something inside her break with each callous bid. These men weren't seeing a woman with dreams, fears, and hopes. They saw a commodity, a broken tool that might still have some use if the price was right. Her hands shook as she remembered her wedding day 3 years ago, how beautiful she had felt in her mother's dress, how certain she had been that love would be enough to build a life on, how wrong she had been. $10. The voice came from a man in the front row, his small eyes glinting with something that made Mabel's skin crawl. But I want to inspect the goods first. He started toward the platform, and Mabel took an involuntary step backward. Now hold on, Jenkins, the auctioneer said with a nervous laugh. This is a proper auction, not a cattle sale. But Jenkins was already climbing the wooden steps, his meaty hands reaching toward Mabel. A man's got a right to know what he's buying, he said, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Turn around, girl. Let me see what I'm getting for my money." Mabel's heart hammered against her ribs as the man approached. She looked desperately toward her father, hoping to see some flicker of protection, some remnant of the man who had once chased away boys who looked at her wrong. But Thomas Hutchins had turned his back on the platform, his attention focused on counting the coins in his weathered hands. "Please," Mabel whispered, but Jenkins was already reaching for her arm. $15. The voice cut through the marketplace like a blade, quiet, but carrying absolute authority. Every head turned toward the source, a tall man standing at the back of the crowd, his broad shoulders filling out a faded flannel shirt. He was older than most of the bidders, perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was weathered by years of outdoor work, marked by lines that spoke of both hardship and laughter. Jenkins paused, his hand inches from Mabel's arm. "Did you say something, Blackwood?" The man, Silas Blackwood, stepped forward, and the crowd parted before him like water. Mabel had heard his name whispered in town, usually accompanied by headshakes and hushed tones. The hermit lumberjack who lived in the woods with his 4 children, the man who had lost his wife in childbirth and rarely came to town except for supplies. "I said $15, Silas repeated, his voice steady and calm. "That's my bid." The auctioneer looked between Jenkins and Silas, clearly sensing the tension crackling between the two men. We have 15 from Mr. Blackwood. Do I hear 20? Jenkins snarled, his face reddening with anger. "And I was here first." Silas's eyes never left Jenkins' face. 25. A hush fell over the crowd. $25 was more money than most men saw in 2 months. Mabel found herself staring at this stranger who was willing to pay such a price for someone the world had labeled worthless. 30, Jenkins said through gritted teeth, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. 50. The single word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Even Thomas Hutchins turned around, his eyes wide with surprise. $50 was a small fortune, enough to buy a good horse or pay for a winter's worth of supplies. Jenkins' face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple. "You're out of your mind, Blackwood," he spat. "No woman's worth that much, especially not a barren one." Silas finally looked away from Jenkins, his gaze finding Mabel's face. For a moment their eyes met across the crowd, and she saw something there that she had never seen before in a man's gaze when he looked at her. Not desire, not calculation, not disappointment. Respect, as if she were a person worthy of consideration rather than a problem to be solved. $50 going once, the auctioneer called, his voice shaking slightly. Going twice. The hammer fell with finality, and Mabel felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. Whatever this man Silas Blackwood wanted from her, it couldn't be worse than what Jenkins had planned. Thomas Hutchins approached the platform, his greedy eyes fixed on the money-changing hands. "Well now," he said with forced joviality, "looks like you got yourself a bargain, Blackwood. She can cook and clean, I'll give her that much." Silas counted out the bills with deliberate precision, pressing them into Thomas's eager palm. "That makes us even," he said quietly. "Don't ever contact her again." The older man's face darkened. "Now see, here she's still she's not your anything." Silas interrupted, his voice carrying a note of steel that made Thomas step backward. "You just sold whatever claim you had to her for $50. Honor the deal." Mabel watched this exchange with growing amazement. When was the last time someone had stood up for her? When had anyone treated her like something precious rather than something broken? Silas turned to face her, and she was struck again by the gentleness in his storm-gray eyes. He was handsome in a rough, unpolished way, but it was his careful movements and soft voice that made her pulse quicken with something that wasn't quite fear. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his worn hat slightly, "my name is Silas Blackwood. I'd like to offer you a place in my home if you're willing." The simple courtesy of being asked rather than commanded left Mabel speechless for a moment. I don't understand, she stammered. You don't even know me. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. I know enough. I know you deserve better than this. He gestured toward the dispersing crowd, many of whom were still staring at them with undisguised curiosity. I have 4 children who need a woman's touch and a home that could use some warmth. In return, I can offer you safety, respect, and a chance to start over. Mabel felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. After 3 years of being told she was worthless, broken a failure as a woman, this stranger was offering her hope. What about my condition? She asked quietly, the shame burning in her throat. Silas's expression grew gentle. What about it? A woman's worth isn't measured by her ability to bear children any more than a man's worth is measured by his ability to swing an axe. You're a human being deserving of dignity and kindness. That's all I need to know. The tears spilled over, then hot trails down her cheeks, that she quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. In all her 23 years, no one had ever spoken to her with such fundamental respect for her humanity. Why, she whispered, why would you do this for a stranger? Silas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Because someone should, he said finally. Because every person deserves a chance to start over, to be valued for who they are rather than what they can or can't do. He paused, then added more quietly, and because I know what it's like to feel like the world has no place for you. Mabel looked around the marketplace one last time at her father counting his money, at Jenkins glaring at them both with undisguised hatred, at the townspeople whispering behind their hands. Then she looked back at Silas Blackwood, this rough-edged stranger who had just paid $50 for her freedom. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I'll come with you. Silas nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both satisfaction and promise. He shrugged out of his heavy wool coat and draped it around her shoulders, the garment still warm from his body and smelling of pine needles and wood smoke. My wagon's just over there, he said, gesturing toward a sturdy-looking cart hitched to 2 patient draft horses. Are you ready to go home? Home. The word sent a shiver through Mabel that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. She had lost her home when her mother died, lost it again when her marriage failed, and had been homeless, in spirit if not in body, ever since. Could this man, this family of strangers, really offer her such a thing? As they walked toward the wagon, Mabel became aware of the stares following them. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, stood with her mouth agape. Young Timothy Fletcher, who had once courted Mabel before learning of her condition, watched with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been regret. Let them look, Silas said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Their opinions matter less than dust on the wind. He helped her up onto the wagon seat with the same careful courtesy he might have shown a lady stepping into a fine carriage. The simple gesture of his hand supporting her elbow, the way he made sure she was settled before taking his own seat. It was such a stark contrast to the rough handling she had endured from other men that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. Are you cold? He asked, noticing her shiver. No, she said quickly, then added more honestly, well, yes, but it's not just the weather. Silas picked up the reins but didn't immediately urge the horses forward. Fear is natural, he said gently. You don't know me, don't know what kind of life I'm offering. But I give you my word, no harm will come to you in my house. You'll be treated with respect and kindness, nothing more or less than any person deserves. Mabel studied his profile as he spoke, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the careful way he held his hands on the reins. Everything about him suggested strength, held in check power, tempered by gentleness. Tell me about your children, she said as the wagon began to move, carrying her away from the only life she had ever known. A different kind of light entered Silas's eyes, the fierce, protective love of a devoted father. Ben's the oldest at 14, thinks he's a man, already stubborn as a mule, but with a good heart. Sarah's 12, smart as a whip and twice as sharp-tongued. She's been trying to mother the younger ones since... He paused, then continued. Since their mama died. The twins Jacob and Hannah are 8. Jacob's the explorer, always getting into trouble, and Hannah's the dreamer, always got her nose in a book when she can get her hands on one. They must miss their mother terribly, Mabel said softly. Silas's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. It's been 4 years now. They've adjusted in their way, but a house full of children needs a woman's influence. I've done my best, but there are things... He trailed off, then shook his head. I'm sorry, I don't mean to suggest that you're just a replacement, or that... I understand, Mabel interrupted gently. You're offering me a role, a purpose. That's more than anyone has offered me in a very long time. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the wagon wheels crunching over fallen leaves, and the horse's breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Mabel found herself studying the landscape as they left the town behind rolling hills, covered in oak and maple trees, ablaze with autumn color, a creek that sparkled in the dappled sunlight fields, where the last of the harvest waited to be gathered. It's beautiful, she murmured. This is nothing, Silas said with quiet pride. Wait until you see the land around our place. 500 acres of the prettiest country you ever laid eyes on. Good soil, clean water, timber as far as you can see. 500 acres? Mabel couldn't hide her amazement. That was more land than most farmers ever dreamed of owning. My grandfather homesteaded it, Silas explained. Built the original cabin with his own hands, cleared the first fields, planted the first orchard. My father expanded it, and now... He shrugged. Now it's mine to tend to pass on to my children. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, but there was something else there too. A deep sense of responsibility, of stewardship, rather than mere ownership. This was a man who understood that the land was both gift and burden, something to be cherished and protected. What will you tell them about me? Mabel asked as they crested a hill, and she caught her first glimpse of smoke rising from a chimney in the distance. Silas was quiet for a moment, considering. The truth, he said finally, that you're a woman who needed a fresh start, and we're a family that could use your help, that we're all going to figure out how to live together with kindness and respect. And if they don't accept me, they will, Silas said with quiet confidence. Children have a way of seeing past the judgments that twist up adults. They'll measure you by how you treat them, not by what the town gossips say about you. As they drew closer to the cabin, Mabel could make out more details. It was larger than she had expected, a 2-story log structure with a wide front porch and multiple chimneys. Smoke rose from one of them, suggesting someone was tending the fire inside. The yard was neat and well-maintained, with a vegetable garden that had been recently harvested and a small orchard where apple trees, heavy with fruit, caught the afternoon sunlight. It looked like home. Silas, she said suddenly, using his name for the first time. It felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her blush. Yes, thank you. The words seemed inadequate for what he had done, but they were all she had. He turned to look at her fully for the first time since they had left town, his gray eyes searching her face. Don't thank me yet, he said softly. Wait until you see if this life suits you. Wait until you decide if we're worth staying for. The wagon pulled into the yard just as the cabin door burst open and 4 children spilled out onto the porch. Mabel's breath caught in her throat as she got her first look at the family that might, if she was very lucky, become her own. Ben was indeed trying hard to be a man, his shoulders set with determined squareness, even as his face betrayed his youth. Sarah stood with her hands on her hips, her expression wary but curious as she studied the stranger their father had brought home. The twins, Jacob and Hannah, hung back slightly, but their eyes were bright with interest. Papa, Hannah called out, her voice high and sweet. You're back. Silas's face transformed, as he looked at his children, love and pride shining from every line. This was a man who had found his purpose in being a father, who had built his life around these 4 young souls who depended on him. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm back," he called as he set the wagon brake. "And I've brought someone I want you all to meet." He climbed down from the wagon and moved around to help Mabel down, his strong hands gentle at her waist as he lifted her to the ground. The simple touch sent an unexpected warmth through her, and she found herself looking up into his eyes with something that might have been gratitude or might have been something deeper. "Children," Silas said, his voice carrying the authority of a father, but also a note of gentle request. "This is Miss Mabel. She's going to be staying with us for a while, helping with the house, and—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Helping us be a family." Sarah stepped forward first, her 12-year-old eyes older than they should have been. "Are you going to be our new mama?" she asked bluntly. The question hung in the air like morning mist, delicate and easily disturbed. Mabel felt all eyes on her, not just the children's, but Silas's as well, as if her answer would set the tone for everything that followed. "I don't know," she said honestly, kneeling down so she was at eye level with the children. "I hope we can be friends first, and then see what happens. Would that be all right with you?" It was Hannah who broke the silence, stepping forward with the fearless curiosity of an 8-year-old. "You're very pretty," she said matter-of-factly. "Prettier than Mrs. Wilson from town, and she thinks she's the prettiest lady in the whole county." Mabel felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth, the first genuine smile she had managed in longer than she could remember. "Thank you, Hannah. You're very pretty yourself." Jacob, not to be outdone by his twin, stepped forward as well. "Can you cook?" he asked, with the practical concern of a boy who had been eating his father's cooking for 4 years. "I can," Mabel said solemnly. "Can you eat?" "I can eat anything," Jacob declared proudly. "Even Papa's burned biscuits." "Hey now," Silas protested with mock indignation, and for the first time since her world had crumbled, Mabel found herself laughing, really laughing from somewhere deep in her chest, where hope had been hiding. Ben, still trying to maintain his manly dignity, stepped forward last. "Are you going to stay?" he asked, and beneath the gruff attempt at authority, Mabel heard the question of a boy who had lost too much already. "I'd like to," she said gently, "if you'll have me." Ben studied her for a long moment, his young face serious. Then he nodded once, a gesture that reminded her strongly of his father. "All right then," he said. "Welcome home." Welcome home. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mabel stood in the yard of the Blackwood cabin, surrounded by the people who might, just might, become her family. For the first time in 3 long years, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps her story wasn't over after all. Perhaps it was just beginning. The evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and the promise of dinner, and as Silas guided her toward the cabin that might become her sanctuary, Mabel felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The warmth that had begun to bloom in Mabel's chest during those first moments in the yard lasted exactly as long as it took to cross the threshold of the Blackwood cabin. The moment she stepped inside, the weight of her new reality settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, and she realized that good intentions and kind words were only the beginning of what would surely be the most challenging chapter of her life. The interior of the cabin was spacious but bore the unmistakable signs of a household that had been managing without a woman's touch for far too long. Dishes were stacked haphazardly on the kitchen table, clothes hung from chairbacks and door frames, and a thin layer of dust covered most surfaces. The smell of burned coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the more pleasant aromas of wood smoke and something that might have been stew simmering over the fire. Sarah noticed Mabel's surveying gaze and lifted her chin defensively. "I know it's not perfect," she said, her voice carrying an edge that spoke of years spent trying to fill shoes too big for her 12-year-old feet. "I do my best, but there's only so much one person can manage." Of course, Mabel said quickly, recognizing the defensive pride in the girl's tone. I can see you've been working very hard. You've done an amazing job keeping everything together. Something in Sarah's posture relaxed slightly, but her eyes remained wary. This was a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly, who had shouldered responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. Mabel's heart ached for her, recognizing something of her own childhood in Sarah's fierce independence. Sarah's been the lady of the house since she was 8, Silas said quietly, his voice filled with both pride and regret. She's kept us all in line, haven't you, sweetheart? Someone had to, Sarah replied, but there was affection beneath the tartness. Jacob would have burned the house down by now if left to his own devices. I would not, Jacob protested, but his grin suggested he wasn't entirely offended by the accusation. That was only one time, and the fire wasn't even that big. What fire? Mabel asked, unable to hide her alarm. He tried to cook breakfast for Papa's birthday. Hannah explained with the patient tone of someone who had told this story many times before. But he put the bacon in the oven instead of the skillet, and then he forgot about it while he was outside chasing chickens. The smoke was black as night, Ben added, with the dramatic flair of a practiced storyteller. You could see it from town, I reckon. Mrs. Patterson came running over thinking we were all burning alive. Silas rubbed his forehead with one hand, but Mabel could see the smile he was trying to hide. It was an eventful morning, he said diplomatically. The kitchen still smells like smoke sometimes when it rains, Sarah added matter-of-factly. But we got it cleaned up and Jacob's not allowed to use the oven anymore without supervision. Mabel found herself laughing again despite her nervousness. There was something infectious about the easy way this family teased each other, the obvious love that existed beneath the gentle ribbing. It was so different from the cold silence that had filled her father's house in recent years, or the tense atmosphere that had eventually poisoned her marriage. Well, she said, looking around the cabin with fresh eyes, it seems like you all have quite a few stories to tell. I hope I'll hear more of them. Oh, you will, Ben said with a grin that transformed his serious young face. Whether you want to or not, Hannah's got about 1,000,000 stories and she never gets tired of telling them. I do not tell stories, Hannah protested with 8-year-old dignity. I tell adventures, real ones that happen to me and Jacob and sometimes Sarah if she's not being too grown up to play. Adventures? Mabel asked, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. It felt strange to sit down in this house to claim even such a small space as her own, but Silas had gestured for her to make herself comfortable. Hannah's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Oh yes, just last week Jacob and I found a secret cave behind the waterfall up on Miller's Creek. It was dark and mysterious, and there were bats hanging from the ceiling like little black umbrellas. It wasn't mysterious, Jacob corrected with brotherly exactitude. It was just a cave, but it was pretty deep, and our voices echoed when we shouted. That sounds wonderful, Mabel said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. When was the last time she had thought about adventures or mysteries or anything beyond the grinding daily reality of survival and shame? Did you explore it? Papa wouldn't let us go back without him, Sarah said, shooting her father a look that suggested this had been a source of some argument. He said it wasn't safe. Because it isn't, Silas said firmly. Old caves can have loose rocks or deep pools or any number of things that could hurt a curious child. If you want to explore it properly, we'll do it together with ropes and lanterns and proper preparation. When? Jacob demanded immediately. Tomorrow, can we go tomorrow? We'll see, Silas said with the diplomatic non-answer of an experienced father. First, let's help Miss Mabel get settled, and then we'll talk about adventures. The mention of getting settled brought reality crashing back over Mabel like a cold wave. She looked around the cabin again, this time wondering where exactly she would fit into this established household. Where would she sleep? What would her duties be? How long would it take before they realized they had made a mistake in taking her in? As if reading her thoughts. Silas cleared his throat. "I should show you where you'll be staying," he said. "Sarah, would you mind putting some coffee on? The real kind, not the burned stuff I made this morning." "I can make coffee," Mabel said quickly, starting to rise from her chair. "Sit," Sarah said with surprising authority for a 12-year-old. "Your company today. Tomorrow you can start earning your keep, but today you just arrived. Even Papa knows better than to put guests to work the minute they walk in the door." "Do I?" Silas asked with raised eyebrows. "That's news to me. I seem to remember putting Ben to work chopping wood about 5 minutes after he was big enough to hold an axe." "That's different," Sarah said dismissively. "Ben's family. He doesn't get to be lazy." "I'm not lazy," Ben protested. "I work harder than anyone else in this house." "You work harder than the twins," Sarah conceded graciously. "But that's not saying much, considering Jacob spent an hour yesterday trying to teach the chickens to fetch sticks." "They were learning," Jacob said defensively. "Gertrude almost brought one back." "Gertrude is a chicken, Jacob. Chickens don't fetch." "How do you know? Have you ever tried to teach them?" Mabel listened to this familiar sibling banter with a growing sense of wonder. This was what a real family sounded like, not the careful politeness of strangers trying to avoid conflict, but the comfortable chaos of people who loved each other enough to argue about ridiculous things like chicken training. "Come on," Silas said quietly, touching her elbow. "Let me show you your room before these four start a full-scale debate about the intelligence of poultry." He led her up a narrow wooden staircase to the second floor of the cabin. The hallway was lined with several doors, and Mabel could hear the sounds of daily life behind them, clothes being moved around, books being stacked, the general rustling of children trying to make their spaces presentable for a visitor. "The children are all up here," Silas explained as they walked. "Ben and Jacob share the room at the end of the hall, and the girls have the room next to them. This one," he stopped in front of a door near the staircase, "is yours." He opened the door to reveal a small but comfortable-looking room with a single window that faced west toward the mountains. There was a narrow bed covered with a simple quilt, a chest of drawers that looked handmade, and a chair positioned near the window. It was sparse but clean, and someone had placed a small vase of wildflowers on the windowsill. "Sarah's doing," Silas said, noticing her gaze. "She thought you might like some flowers to brighten the room." Mabel felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. When was the last time someone had thought to do something nice for her simply because they wanted her to feel welcome? "It's lovely," she managed to say. "Really lovely." "It's not much," Silas said, suddenly sounding uncertain. "I know it's small and the furniture is nothing fancy. If you need anything else, anything at all, just—" "It's perfect," Mabel interrupted, turning to face him. "It's more than I had any right to expect." They stood there for a moment in the small room, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window and casting everything in shades of gold. Mabel was acutely aware of Silas's presence, of the way he seemed to fill the space, with his quiet strength, of the careful way he was watching her face, as if trying to gauge her true feelings. "Silas," she said softly, "why did you really do this? At the auction, I mean, you could have found a housekeeper or a wife if that's what you needed. Someone without my complications." He was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful, as if he were sharing something he rarely put into words. "4 years ago, when Mary died, I thought my world had ended," he said. "Not just because I loved her, though I did, but because suddenly I was alone with 4 children and no idea how to be both mother and father to them. The town women, they meant well, but they kept telling me I needed to find a new wife, someone to complete my family, as if Mary could be replaced like a broken dish." He moved to the window, staring out at the mountains in the distance. "I realized that what people were really saying was that I wasn't enough on my own, that my children needed someone, anyone who could fulfill the role of mother, regardless of who that person actually was. It was about the function, not the person. Mabel felt her heart tighten with understanding. And you thought I might feel the same way, about being valued for my function rather than myself. When I saw you standing on that platform today, listening to men bid on you like you were livestock. His voice hardened with remembered anger. You looked like I felt in those first months after Mary died, like someone who had been told they weren't enough, weren't worthy of being chosen for who they are rather than what they could provide. He turned back to face her, his gray eyes intense. I don't need a wife, Mabel. I mean, someday, maybe if the right person came along and we both wanted that. But what I needed today was to help someone who deserved better than what the world was offering them. What my children need is someone who will care about them as people, not someone who sees them as obligations to be managed. The simple honesty of his words hit Mabel like a physical blow. Here was a man who had looked at her situation and seen not an opportunity to acquire unpaid labor, but a chance to offer kindness to someone who needed it. The contrast with every other interaction she'd had with men in recent years was so stark, it left her speechless. I don't know how to do this, she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside her. I don't know how to be part of a family anymore. I'm not sure I ever really knew. None of us do, Silas said gently. We've all been figuring it out as we go along, making mistakes and trying to do better the next time. That's what families are. I think groups of people who care enough about each other to keep trying even when it's hard. From downstairs came the sound of Sarah's voice, raised in exasperation. Jacob, get that chicken out of the kitchen this instant. But she followed me in, came Jacob's plaintive reply. I think she wants to help with dinner. Chickens don't help with dinner, they are dinner. Don't say that in front of Gertrude, you'll hurt her feelings. Silas sighed and shook his head, but he was smiling. See what I mean? We're all just muddling through and hoping for the best. Mabel, Hannah's voice called from downstairs. Come see what I found. It's a book about a lady who goes on adventures. You'd better go, Silas said. Hannah gets very excited about her books, and she's been wanting someone new to share them with. Sarah's heard all her stories about a dozen times. As they headed back downstairs, Mabel felt some of the tension in her shoulders beginning to ease. These people weren't expecting her to be perfect, or to immediately transform their lives, or to fill some impossible ideal of womanhood. They were simply inviting her to try to be part of their imperfect, loving, chaotic family and see what happened. The kitchen was indeed in a state of mild chaos when they returned. Sarah was chasing Jacob around the table while he clutched a fat red hen to his chest, both of them laughing despite Sarah's protests. Ben was trying to look disapproving but failing to hide his amusement, and Hannah was sitting on the floor surrounded by a pile of books, apparently oblivious to the poultry-related drama unfolding around her. Gertrude was lonely, Jacob insisted, as he dodged his sister's grabbing hands. She wanted to come inside where it's warm. Gertrude is a chicken, Jacob, Sarah panted. She belongs in the chicken coop, not in the kitchen. She's a very smart chicken, Jacob said defensively. Tell her, Gertrude, tell Sarah how smart you are. The hen in question clucked once as if on cue, which sent Jacob into delighted laughter. See? She understands every word I say. Mabel found herself laughing as she watched this domestic comedy unfold. When was the last time she had been in a house filled with such easy joy, such comfortable chaos? Her own childhood had been marked by quiet efficiency, and her brief marriage had been a study in tense politeness. This was something entirely different, messier, noisier, but somehow infinitely more alive. All right, that's enough, Silas said with parental authority. Jacob, take Gertrude back to the coop where she belongs. Sarah, thank you for defending our dinner preparations from poultry invasion. Hannah, are you planning to read every book you own to Miss Mabel before supper? Maybe, Hannah said seriously. She needs to know all the good stories so she can tell them back to us when we can't sleep. Is that what mothers do? Mabel asked, settling down on the floor beside Hannah. Tell stories when children can't sleep. Our mama used to, Hannah said matter-of-factly. She knew hundreds of stories and she could make up new ones whenever we asked. Sometimes she would tell us stories about brave princesses who saved kingdoms, or clever girls who outsmarted giants, or magical horses that could fly. Those sound like wonderful stories, Mabel said softly. They were, but Sarah doesn't know very many stories, and Papa's stories are all about things like chopping wood and building barns. They're nice stories, but they're not very exciting. Hey now, Silas protested mildly. I'll have you know my story about the time I wrestled a bear is very exciting. You didn't wrestle a bear, Papa, Ben said with the long-suffering tone of someone who had heard this tale many times. You ran away from a bear, very quickly. Running away from a bear is a perfectly sensible thing to do, Silas said with dignity. And it makes for a much more exciting story if you tell it right. Can you tell stories? Hannah asked Mabel hopefully. Real ones with adventures and magic and people who live happily ever after. Mabel felt a flutter of panic. She had never been particularly good at storytelling, had never had much occasion to practice. But looking into Hannah's eager young face, she found herself nodding. I can try, she said, though they might not be as good as your mama's stories. That's all right, Hannah said generously. We're not very particular. By the time Jacob returned from the chicken coop without Gertrude, Sarah had managed to restore some semblance of order to the kitchen. Coffee was brewing, the table was cleared, and something that smelled significantly better than Silas's usual cooking was simmering in a pot over the fire. What are we having for dinner? Ben asked, lifting the lid of the pot and inhaling appreciatively. Stew, Sarah said proudly. I've been working on it all day. There's beef from the cow we butchered last month and vegetables from the garden, and I even managed not to burn the bread this time. It smells wonderful, Bepple said, and meant it. The rich aroma of meat and vegetables filled the kitchen, making her realize how long it had been since she'd had a proper meal. The anxiety and humiliation of the morning had left her with no appetite, but now she found herself genuinely hungry for the first time in days. Sarah's become quite the cook, Silas said with obvious pride. She's been experimenting with different recipes, trying to figure out what everyone likes best. I'm still working on it, Sarah said, but Mabel could hear the pleasure in her voice at her father's praise. Some things turn out better than others. They gathered around the table as the sun set outside, and Mabel found herself experiencing something she had almost forgotten, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with people who seemed genuinely glad she was there. The conversation flowed easily, moving from plans for the next day's work to stories about neighbors and townspeople, to Hannah's latest reading adventure. Mrs. Patterson's cat had kittens again, Sarah reported as she served the stew. 7 of them this time. She's trying to find homes for them, but I think she's fighting a losing battle. That cat has kittens twice a year, regular as clockwork. We should get a kitten, Jacob suggested hopefully. A orange one to match my hair. We have a cat, Ben pointed out. Old Tom keeps the mice out of the grain stores just fine. Old Tom is ancient and lazy, Jacob countered Ton. He spends most of his time sleeping in the barn. We need a young cat, one with energy and spirit. What we need, Silas said diplomatically, is to finish the harvest before we start adding more animals to feed, though I admit some of those kittens are pretty appealing. Can we at least go look at them? Hannah asked. Mrs. Patterson said we could visit any time. We'll see, Silas said, which Mabel was beginning to recognize as his standard response to requests that required further consideration. As the meal progressed, Mabel found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't in years. These people were including her in their conversations, naturally, asking for her opinions, laughing at her tentative jokes. For the first time since her marriage had failed, she felt like she might actually belong somewhere. So what do you think, Miss Mabel? Sarah asked as she cleared the dinner dishes. Are you ready to join our particular brand of organized chaos? I think, Mabel said carefully, that it might be the most beautiful chaos I've ever seen. Later that evening, after the dishes were washed and the children had been sent upstairs to prepare for bed, Mabel found herself alone in the kitchen with Silas. He was banking the fire for the night, and she was wiping down the table, both of them moving around each other with the careful politeness of people still learning each other's rhythms. "They like you," Silas said quietly as he arranged the logs. "I wasn't sure how they'd react to having a stranger in the house, but they seem comfortable with you." "They're wonderful children," Mabel replied honestly. "You've done an amazing job raising them." "I've done my best. It hasn't always been easy trying to be everything they need." Mabel hung the dish towel on its hook and turned to face him. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Earlier when you said you didn't need a wife, did you mean that you don't want to remarry, ever?" Silas straightened slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I meant that I'm not looking for someone to fill a role, to complete some picture of what a family should look like. If I ever marry again, it will be because I find someone I want to share my life with, someone who wants to share theirs with me. Not because society says I need a wife or because my children need a mother. And if that person turned out to be someone like me, someone who can't give you more children." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the flickering firelight. "Mabel," he said finally, "I have 4 children already. 4 bright, healthy, wonderful children who are the center of my world. If I never have another child, I will still consider myself the luckiest man alive." The simple sincerity in his voice made her chest tight with emotion. Most men wouldn't feel that way. "Then most men are fools," Silas said matter-of-factly. "Children are a blessing, not a requirement. And love, real love, isn't about what someone can give you. It's about who they are, how they make you feel, whether you can imagine your life being better with them in it." From upstairs came the sound of Jacob's voice raised in protest. "But I'm not tired, and Hannah said she would show me the pictures in her new book. Jacob Blackwood, you get in that bed this instant." Sarah's voice carried clearly down the stairs. "You can look at Hannah's book tomorrow. She's quite the little mother." Mabel observed, grateful for the interruption. The conversation with Silas was stirring feelings she wasn't sure she was ready to examine. "She has been since she was 8 years old," Silas said, his voice tinged with sadness. "Sometimes I worry that she's growing up too fast, taking on responsibilities that should be mine." "She loves them," Mabel said gently. "You can see it in everything she does. Yes, she's grown up quickly, but she's also learned to be strong, capable, caring. Those aren't bad things for a young woman to learn." "No," Silas agreed, "but I'd like her to have time to be a child too, to play and be silly, and not worry about whether there's enough firewood for winter or whether the twins are eating properly." Mabel felt a sudden fierce desire to help make that possible, to take some of the burden off Sarah's young shoulders, to give her the chance to be 12 years old instead of a miniature adult. The intensity of the feeling surprised her. She had been in this house for only a few hours, and already she was beginning to care about these people in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. "Miss Mabel," Hannah's voice called from the top of the stairs, "could you come up? I want to show you something." Mabel looked questioningly at Silas, who nodded with a smile. "Go ahead. Hannah's been dying to share her books with someone new. Just don't let her keep you up all night with stories." As Mabel climbed the stairs, she could hear the sounds of the household settling for the night. Ben's voice murmuring to Jacob in their shared room, Sarah humming softly as she braided her hair, the creak of floorboards, as everyone moved through their evening routines. It was such a peaceful sound, so different from the silence that had filled her father's house, or the tension that had marked her marriage. Hannah's room was small but cozy, with 2 narrow beds and walls lined with makeshift bookshelves. The 8-year-old was sitting cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by what looked like every book she owned. "Look at all these," Hannah said excitedly as Mabel sat down beside her. "This one's about a girl who disguises herself as a boy to become a knight. And this one's about a princess who saves her kingdom from a dragon. And this one's about a lady who explores the whole world and writes down everything she sees." "These all sound wonderful," Mabel said, genuinely impressed by the collection. "Where did you get so many books?" "Papa orders them from a catalog," Hannah explained proudly. "Every few months he lets me pick out 2 new ones. Sarah says it's wasteful that we should spend the money on practical things, but Papa says learning is the most practical thing there is." "Your papa is a wise man," Mabel said, picking up one of the books and examining the cover. "And you're very lucky to have so many wonderful stories to read." "Mama used to read to me," Hannah said matter-of-factly, "before she died. She said that books could take you anywhere you wanted to go and teach you about things you'd never see in real life." "She was right about that," Mabel said softly. "Books are like magic in a way." "Do you like to read?" Hannah asked, hopefully. "I do, though I haven't had much time for it lately. My father thought books were a waste of time for girls. He said we should focus on practical skills instead." Hannah's eyes widened with indignation. "That's silly. Books teach you practical things too. This one," she held up a thick volume, "taught me all about different plants and which ones you can eat and which ones are poisonous. And this one taught me about different countries and what the people there eat and how they build their houses." "Those do sound very practical," Mabel agreed. "Maybe you could teach me some of the things you've learned." "Really?" Hannah's face lit up with excitement. "You'd want to learn from me?" "I think you might be the smartest 8-year-old I've ever met," Mabel said honestly. "I bet you could teach me all sorts of interesting things." Hannah beamed at the compliment, then suddenly grew serious. "Miss Mabel, are you going to stay with us?" "Really stay? I mean, not just for a few days." The question caught Mabel off guard. I hope so, Hannah. I'd like to stay if your family wants me to." "We do," Hannah said, with the absolute certainty of childhood. "Papa's been sad for a long time, even though he tries to hide it. And Sarah works too hard, and Ben pretends he doesn't need anybody, but he does, and Jacob needs someone to tell him when his ideas are too dangerous before he tries them." "And what about you?" Mabel asked gently. "What do you need?" Hannah considered this seriously. "I need someone to tell me stories," she said finally, "and someone to listen when I want to talk about the things I read, and someone who smells like flowers instead of wood smoke and leather." Mabel felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "I think I can manage all of those things." "Good," Hannah said, settling back against her pillows with satisfaction. "Now, do you want to hear about the Lady Knight? It's a really exciting story, and she's very brave and clever." As Hannah launched into an animated retelling of her favorite book, complete with dramatic gestures and voice changes for different characters, Mabel felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in years, she was exactly where she wanted to be, doing exactly what she wanted to do. The fear and uncertainty were still there, lurking at the edges of her consciousness, but they were overshadowed by something warmer and more powerful: hope, love, the possibility of belonging. When Hannah finally fell asleep in the middle of describing a particularly dramatic sword fight, Mabel carefully tucked the covers around the little girl's shoulders and tiptoed out of the room. The hallway was quiet now. The other children settled for the night, and she could see light seeping from under Silas's door at the far end of the hall. She made her way to her own small room where Sarah probably had left a pitcher of warm water and a towel for washing. The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture made her throat tight with emotion. As she prepared for bed, Mabel caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the dresser and was startled by what she saw. The woman looking back at her looked different. Still tired, still marked by the trials of recent years, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there that morning. A spark of life, a glimmer of possibility. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Mabel fell asleep not with tears on her cheeks, but with a smile on her lips. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears to face and overcome. But tonight she was safe, surrounded by people who had welcomed her with open hearts and asked for nothing in return except the chance to care for each other. It was more than she had dared to hope for, and it was only the beginning. The first week passed in a blur of learning and adjustment that left Mabel feeling both exhausted and more alive than she had in years. Each morning brought new challenges as she struggled to find her place in the established rhythms of the Blackwood household, and each evening brought small victories that made her heart swell with cautious hope. She discovered that Jacob's boundless energy required constant supervision. The boy seemed drawn to danger like a moth to flame, whether it was climbing too high in the apple trees or attempting to train the farm animals to perform impossible tricks. Sarah, despite her initial wariness, gradually began to share the burden of household management, though Mabel could see the girl struggling to relinquish control she had held for so long. Ben worked alongside his father with the serious dedication of someone determined to prove his worth as a man, while Hannah flitted between them all like a curious butterfly, asking endless questions about everything Mabel did. And Silas watched it all with those storm-gray eyes, saying little but missing nothing, ready to step in when tensions rose too high or when someone needed gentle guidance back to calmer waters. It was on a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 8 days after her arrival, that the fragile peace Mabel had begun to take for granted was shattered by an unexpected visitor. She was in the kitchen teaching Hannah how to braid bread dough when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up from their work. Through the window, Mabel could see a horse and rider coming up the long drive to the cabin, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than a casual social call. "Papa," Jacob's voice called from somewhere outside. "Someone's coming." Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping sawdust from his hands with a rag. He had been working in his shop since dawn, crafting furniture to sell in town, and there were wood shavings caught in his dark hair. "Stay inside," he said quietly to Mabel and Hannah. "I'll see what this is about." But even as he spoke, Mabel felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. The rider was close enough now that she could make out his features, and recognition hit her like a physical blow. Thomas Hutchins sat astride his old bay mare, his face set in lines of grim determination that Mabel knew all too well. Her father had come. "Papa," Hannah said uncertainly, sensing the sudden tension in the room. "Who is that man?" Before Mabel could answer, the sound of harsh voices carried through the open window. Thomas had dismounted and was striding toward Silas with the aggressive posture of a man spoiling for a fight. "Blackwood," Thomas called out, his voice carrying the edge of barely controlled rage. "I want to talk to you about my daughter." Mabel's hands began to shake as she set down the bread dough. Through the window, she could see Ben and Jacob emerging from the barn, drawn by the commotion, while Sarah appeared on the front porch with a concerned expression. "Your daughter chose to come with me," Silas replied, his voice calm but carrying a note of steel. "We had a legal transaction witnessed by the entire town. There's nothing more to discuss." "Legal transaction," Thomas spat, and Mabel could see the flush of anger spreading across his weathered face. "You took advantage of a desperate man, $50 for damaged goods. You must have known she wasn't worth half that." The words hit Mabel like physical blows, each one designed to cut deep into wounds that had barely begun to heal. Hannah gasped beside her, and Mabel realized the little girl was watching this confrontation with wide, frightened eyes. "Hannah," Mabel said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "why don't you go upstairs and—" "No," Hannah said firmly, moving closer to Mabel's side. "I want to stay with you." Outside, Silas had taken a step closer to Thomas, and even from a distance, Mabel could see the dangerous tension in his posture. "I'd suggest you choose your next words very carefully, Hutchins," he said, his voice low and deadly quiet. "You're talking about a woman I consider to be under my protection." "Protection?" Thomas laughed harshly. "From what? The truth. She's barren, Blackwood, useless as a woman. Her own husband sent her back because she couldn't give him children. What kind of protection does a failure like that need?" That was when Sarah exploded. "How dare you!" The 12-year-old's voice rang across the yard with righteous fury as she marched down from the porch. "How dare you come to our home and say such horrible things about Miss Mabel?" "Sarah, stay back," Silas commanded, but his daughter was already positioning herself between the two men, her young face blazing with indignation. "She's not useless," Sarah continued, her voice shaking with emotion. "She's kind and gentle, and she listens when we talk, and she makes Hannah laugh, and she taught me how to make bread that doesn't burn, and she tells the most wonderful stories, and she's more of a mother to us in 1 week than you've been a father to her in her whole life." Thomas's face darkened further at being lectured by a child. "You don't know what you're talking about, girl. That woman is damaged goods, and your father was a fool to—" "Enough!" Silas's voice cut through Thomas's words like an axe through kindling. "Sarah, go inside, now." "But Papa—" "Now, Sarah." The girl shot one more venomous look at Thomas before reluctantly heading back toward the cabin. As she passed the kitchen window, Mabel could see tears of anger glistening in her eyes. "She's a good girl," Thomas said, with grudging approval, as Sarah disappeared inside. "Be a shame if she learned bad habits from someone who—" "If you finish that sentence," Silas interrupted, his voice deadly quiet, "you're going to find yourself picking yourself up off the ground. Mabel is a member of my household now, and I won't tolerate anyone speaking about her with disrespect." "Member of your household," Thomas snorted. "Is that what you're calling it? Well, let me tell you something about your new household member, Blackwood. She's weak, always has been, cries at the drop of a hat, can't handle criticism, thinks the world owes her something just for existing. And when life gets hard, she crumbles like a stale biscuit." Each word was a carefully aimed dart designed to hit Mabel where she was most vulnerable, and they found their mark. Standing at the window, listening to her father catalog her failures for a stranger's benefit, Mabel felt the fragile confidence she had been building over the past week begin to crack. "She couldn't even keep a husband satisfied," Thomas continued relentlessly. "Poor William tried everything, bought her pretty dresses, took her to church socials, was patient with her when she failed month after month to conceive. But in the end, even he couldn't stand the sight of her, sent her home with a note saying he'd rather live alone than with a woman who reminded him daily of his failure to get an heir." "Stop," Mabel whispered, but the words were lost in the distance between the kitchen and the yard. "And now you think you can make something useful out of her?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "Good luck, Blackwood. Just remember, when she disappoints you, when she proves she's not worth the trouble, don't say I didn't warn you." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Mabel's ragged breathing. She was dimly aware of Hannah tugging at her skirt, saying something, but the words seemed to come from very far away. All she could hear was the echo of her father's voice confirming every terrible thing she had ever believed about herself. Damaged goods, useless as a woman, not worth the trouble. "Miss Mabel," Hannah's voice finally penetrated the fog of shame that had settled over her. "Miss Mabel, you're crying." Mabel reached up to touch her cheeks and was surprised to find them wet with tears. When had she started crying? "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. "Why is that man saying those mean things?" Hannah asked, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Why is he being so cruel?" Before Mabel could answer, the kitchen door burst open and Sarah stormed in, her face still flushed with anger. "Don't listen to him," she said fiercely, grabbing Mabel's hands. "Don't listen to a single word that horrible man says. He doesn't know anything about you, not the real you." "Sarah," Mabel began, but the girl cut her off. "No, I know what you're thinking because I can see it in your face. You're thinking maybe he's right. Maybe you don't belong here. Maybe we'll get tired of you and send you away too, but that's not true. You don't understand," Mabel said gently, pulling her hands free. "You're still just a child. You don't know what it means when a woman can't—" "I know what it means to care about someone," Sarah shot back. "And I know what it means to have someone care about you. And I know that you do both of those things better than most grown-ups I've met." Outside, the confrontation was apparently drawing to a close. Through the window, Mabel could see Thomas remounting his horse, while Silas stood with his arms crossed, his expression carved from granite. "You'll regret this, Blackwood," Thomas called as he gathered his reins. "Mark my word, she'll bring you nothing but trouble and disappointment. That girl has never been anything but a burden, and she always will be." "Get off my land," Silas said quietly, but his voice carried clearly through the morning air. "And don't come back. Ever." Thomas spurred his horse and rode away without another word, leaving a cloud of dust and bitter memories hanging in the morning air. Mabel watched him go and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not healing exactly, but a recognition that the man who had just ridden away was no longer her father in any way that mattered. He had given up that right when he sold her like livestock, and any lingering obligation she had felt toward him died as his figure disappeared into the distance. But knowing that didn't make his words hurt any less. The kitchen door opened again, more gently this time, and Silas entered with Ben and Jacob close behind him. All three of them looked shaken by the confrontation, but it was Silas who drew Mabel's attention. His jaw was set in hard lines, and there was something dangerous still flickering in his storm-gray eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his gaze searching her face with obvious concern. Mabel tried to speak but found her throat too tight for words. Instead, she managed a small nod that fooled no one. "He's gone," Silas said, moving closer. "He won't be coming back." "He was mean," Jacob said, with the simple moral clarity of an 8-year-old. "Why did he say those awful things about Miss Mabel? Doesn't he know she's nice?" "Some people," Ben said with the gravity of his 14 years, "are just mean, especially when they're angry about something." "But what's he angry about?" Jacob persisted. "Miss Mabel didn't do anything wrong." Silas knelt down so he was at eye level with the twins. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," he said carefully. "Big mistakes that hurt the people they're supposed to love. And then instead of admitting they were wrong, they try to make themselves feel better by blaming someone else." "That's stupid," Hannah said, with characteristic bluntness. "Yes," Silas agreed. "It is." He stood and turned his attention back to Mabel, who was still struggling to regain her composure. "Would you like to take a walk?" he asked gently. "Sometimes it helps to get some fresh air after difficult conversations." Mabel nodded, not trusting her voice. She needed to move, needed to get away from the kitchen, where her father's poisonous words still seemed to echo off the walls. "We'll finish the bread," Sarah said firmly. "Hannah can show me what you taught her." "But I want to go with Miss Mabel," Hannah protested. "Let her have some time with Papa," Sarah said with wisdom beyond her years. "Sometimes grown-ups need to talk about grown-up things." Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke and the earthy smell of autumn. Silas led her away from the cabin along a well-worn path that wound through the trees toward the sound of running water. They walked in silence for several minutes, their feet crunching through fallen leaves until they reached a small clearing where a creek bubbled over smooth stones. "This is where I come when I need to think," Silas said, settling himself on a fallen log near the water's edge. "Something about the sound of running water helps settle my mind." Mabel sat beside him, careful to leave space between them, but grateful for his solid, comforting presence. For a long time, they simply listened to the creek's gentle murmur and watched the play of sunlight on the water. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "For what?" "For bringing this trouble to your family. For letting him upset the children. For," she gestured helplessly, "for being exactly what he said I was." Silas was quiet for so long that she began to think he wasn't going to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and careful. "Do you remember what I told you yesterday about the bear?" The seemingly random question caught her off guard. "The bear, the one I didn't wrestle, the one I ran away from." He picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in his hands. "The truth is, I was terrified, absolutely bone-deep terrified. I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, crashed through the underbrush, like a mad thing, probably looked like the biggest coward in the territory. But that was smart, Mabel protested. Running from a bear is the sensible thing to do. Exactly. He tossed the stone into the creek where it landed with a soft splash. But for months afterward, I was ashamed. I kept thinking about how I should have stood my ground, should have been braver, should have been the kind of man who faces down wild animals instead of running from them. What changed your mind? Ben did, actually. He was about 10 at the time, and he asked me what I would have done if the bear had been threatening one of them. And I realized that I would have fought that bear with my bare hands, if necessary, not because I was brave, but because I had something worth protecting. Mabel turned to look at him, trying to understand where he was leading with this story. The point is, Silas continued, fear doesn't make you weak. Running from something that could destroy you doesn't make you a coward. And being hurt by someone who was supposed to protect you doesn't make you damaged goods. But he was right about some things, Mabel said quietly. I can't have children. I did disappoint my husband. You are a woman who has been told lies about her worth for so long that you've started to believe them, Silas interrupted firmly. But that doesn't make the lies true. How can you be so sure? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Silas stood and moved to the edge of the creek, staring into the clear water. Because I've watched you with my children for 8 days now. I've seen how Hannah lights up when you read to her, how Jacob actually listens when you tell him something might be dangerous, how Sarah has started to smile again, really smile, not just the polite expression she wears for visitors. He turned back to face her, and there was something fierce and protective in his eyes. I've seen how you notice when Ben is trying too hard to be a man and needs permission to still be a boy sometimes. I've seen how you remember that Sarah likes her coffee with extra cream, and that Jacob is afraid of thunderstorms but doesn't want anyone to know, and that Hannah collects pretty rocks but is embarrassed about it. Mabel felt her throat tighten with emotion. Those are just small things. No, Silas said with quiet intensity. Those are the things that matter. Those are the things that make a family work. Love isn't grand gestures and dramatic declarations. It's paying attention. It's caring about the details that make each person who they are. But what about children? The question burst out of her before she could stop it. What about giving you sons to carry on your name daughters to Mabel? Silas returned to the log and sat down beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Look at me. Reluctantly, she turned to meet his gaze. I have 4 children, he said with quiet conviction. 4 healthy, wonderful children who are the light of my life. If I never have another child, I will still be the richest man in the valley. And if someday I'm blessed to love someone enough to want to share my life with them completely, it won't be because of what they can give me. It will be because of who they are. Most men wouldn't feel that way. Then most men are fools, he said matter-of-factly. Just like I told you before. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the babbling of the creek and the distant sound of the children's voices carried on the breeze. Mabel found herself studying Silas's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair caught the morning light, the gentle strength evident in every line of his body. Why are you being so kind to me? She asked suddenly. He was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. Because someone should, he said simply. Because you deserve kindness. And because, he paused, then continued with careful honesty, because I'm beginning to care about you, more than I probably should given that you've only been here a week. The admission hung in the air between them, delicate and precious. Mabel felt her heart speed up, a flutter of something that might have been hope or might have been fear. She wasn't sure there was much difference anymore. Silas, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I'm not expecting anything. I just wanted you to know that what your father said today, none of it was true. Not about your worth, not about your place here, not about what the future might hold. How can you be so certain? because I've learned to trust what I see with my own eyes instead of what other people tell me I should see. He stood and offered her his hand. Come on, we should get back before the children start to worry. As they walked back toward the cabin, Mabel found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. Silas Blackwood was unlike any man she had ever known, gentle but strong, protective but not possessive, willing to offer comfort without demanding anything in return. The possibility that he might truly care for her, not as a convenience or a solution to a problem, but as a person worthy of affection, was both thrilling and terrifying. They emerged from the trees to find the yard buzzing with activity. Ben was chopping wood with determined precision, his young face set in serious lines. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line while keeping one eye on the twins, who appeared to be engaged in some sort of elaborate game involving the chickens. "Miss Mabel," Hannah called out as soon as she spotted them, "look what we made." She came running toward them, holding up a perfectly braided loaf of bread that was golden brown and beautiful. "Sarah helped, but I did all the braiding myself, just like you showed me." "It's perfect," Mabel said, and meant it. The bread was indeed beautifully shaped, and the fact that Hannah had taken such pride in learning the technique made Mabel's heart swell with affection. "We made enough for dinner and tomorrow's breakfast, too," Sarah added as she approached with a basket of laundry. "I thought maybe we could have it with some of the apple butter we made last week." "That sounds wonderful," Mabel said, struck once again by how naturally these children included her in their plans, their daily rhythms, their simple domestic joys. "Papa," Jacob called from across the yard, "come see what we taught Gertrude." Silas shook his head with resigned amusement. "This should be interesting," he muttered, but he was smiling as he headed toward his son. Mabel watched him go, then turned to find Sarah studying her with a perceptive expression that was far too knowing for a 12-year-old. "You're not going to leave, are you?" Sarah asked quietly. "Because of what that awful man said, Mabel began, then stopped. How could she explain the complex tangle of emotions that her father's visit had stirred up? How could she make a child understand the difference between wanting to stay and believing she deserved to? "He was wrong," Sarah said with fierce conviction, "about everything. You're not any of the things he said you were." "How can you be so sure?" Mabel asked, echoing her earlier question to Silas. "Because I know what it's like when someone doesn't want you around," Sarah said with a matter-of-factness that made Mabel's heart ache. "After Mama died, some of the church ladies tried to convince Papa to send us to live with relatives, said it wasn't proper for a man to raise children alone. They smiled at us and said nice things, but you could tell they thought we were a burden, a problem to be solved." "Oh, Sarah, but you're different," Sarah continued. "When you look at us, you see us, not problems or obligations or little people you have to tolerate. You see Hannah's curiosity and Jacob's energy and Ben's determination to be grown up. You see me trying to keep everyone together, and you don't think I'm too bossy or too serious. You just try to help." Mabel felt tears pricking at her eyes again, but these were different tears, tears of gratitude rather than pain. "You're all very easy to love," she said softly. "So are you," Sarah replied with characteristic bluntness. "That's what Papa sees, and that's what we see. Maybe it's time you started seeing it too." That afternoon, as Mabel helped prepare dinner and listened to the children's chatter about their day, she found herself thinking about Sarah's words. For so long she had defined herself by her failures, by the things she couldn't do or couldn't provide. But here, in this warm kitchen surrounded by laughter and love, she was beginning to glimpse a different version of herself, not the woman who had failed at marriage and motherhood, but the woman who could braid bread with Hannah and soothe Jacob's fears and help Sarah carry the burdens that had been too heavy for such young shoulders. It was a fragile understanding, still too new and tentative to fully trust. But as she watched Silas help Ben with his arithmetic and listened to Hannah read aloud from her latest book, Mabel allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to truly belong here, to be not just tolerated or needed, but genuinely wanted. The thought was both wonderful and terrifying. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, the wonderful outweighed the terrifying, and that felt like the beginning of something that might someday become unshakable hope. The fragile hope that had begun to take root in Mabel's heart was tested in ways she never could have anticipated as autumn deepened into the harsh embrace of an early winter. What started as a season of gradual healing and tentative belonging transformed into a crucible that would either forge unbreakable bonds or shatter the delicate family they were all learning to become. The first sign of trouble came with the weather. October brought unseasonably cold temperatures and early snow that blanketed the mountains in white weeks before anyone expected it. Silas stood on the front porch each morning studying the gray sky with a furrowed brow that spoke of worry he tried to hide from the children. "It's going to be a hard winter," he told Mabel quietly one evening as they stood together in the kitchen, the children already asleep upstairs. "Harder than usual. The almanac predicted it, but I hoped they were wrong." "What does that mean for us?" Mabel asked, though she could already see the concern etched in the lines around his eyes. "It means we need to stretch everything food firewood supplies. It means being more careful than usual, more prepared for anything." He turned to look at her, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. "It means I'm grateful you're here. I don't think I could manage it all alone, not this year." Those words wrapped around Mabel's heart like a warm blanket, but the comfort was short-lived. 3 days later, little Hannah woke with a fever that made her cheeks burn bright red and left her too weak to climb out of bed. "It's just a cold," Sarah said with forced optimism as she dampened a cloth with cool water. "She'll be better in a day or two." But Mabel had seen enough illness in her life to recognize something more serious than a simple cold. Hannah's breathing was labored, her small body shaking with chills despite the fever, and there was a rattling sound in her chest that made Mabel's stomach clench with fear. "I think we should send for Dr. Morrison," she said quietly to Silas when they found themselves alone in the hallway outside Hannah's room. "The doctor's 40 miles away," Silas replied, but she could hear the worry he was trying to hide, and with this snow, the roads might already be impassable. "Then what do we do?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring at the closed door behind which his youngest daughter lay, fighting an illness neither of them fully understood. "We take care of her ourselves," he said finally. "We do everything we can, and we pray it's enough." What followed were 3 of the longest days of Mabel's life. She took turns with Sarah and Silas sitting beside Hannah's bed, spooning broth between her cracked lips, bathing her burning forehead with cool cloths, and trying to coax the stubborn fever to break. Jacob, sensing the gravity of the situation, abandoned his usual mischievous energy and instead sat quietly in the corner of Hannah's room, reading to her from her favorite books in a voice barely above a whisper. "Read the one about the princess again," Hannah whispered on the second night, her voice so hoarse it was barely audible. "The one who saves the kingdom." Jacob obediently opened the familiar book, though Mabel could see his hands shaking slightly as he began to read. Even Ben, usually so determined to maintain his mature facade, hovered anxiously in the doorway, ready to run for anything they might need. It was on the 3rd night that Hannah's condition took a frightening turn. Her fever spiked so high that she began having delirious conversations with people who weren't there, calling out for her mother in a voice that broke everyone's heart. "Mama," she whispered, her eyes wide and unfocused as she stared at something none of them could see. "Mama, I can't find my way home." Mabel felt her own heart breaking as she took Hannah's small hand in hers. "I'm here, sweetheart," she said gently. "You're safe. You're home." "But Mama said she would come back." Hannah continued, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks. "She said she would never leave us. Where is she?" Silas, who had been standing near the window, moved to the other side of the bed and knelt down so he was at eye level with his daughter. "Mama's watching over you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's always watching over you. But Miss Mabel is here now, and she's taking very good care of you." "Miss Mabel." Hannah's unfocused gaze wandered until it found Mabel's face. "Are you going to leave too?" The question hit Mabel like a physical blow. Here was this precious child burning with fever and lost in delirium, and her greatest fear wasn't death, it was abandonment. It was being left alone again. "No, sweetheart," Mabel said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stay right here with you until you're all better. Promise? I promise." Hannah's eyes drifted closed, and for a terrifying moment, Mabel thought she had stopped breathing. But then the little chest rose and fell in the familiar rhythm of sleep, and Mabel felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "She's burning up," Sarah said. From the foot of the bed, her young face etched with worry beyond her years. "The fever's getting worse." Mabel stood and began removing the heavy quilts that covered Hannah's small form. "Help me," she said urgently. "We need to cool her down before the fever does permanent damage." "But she'll be cold," Jacob protested. "The fever will keep her warm," Mabel explained as she and Sarah worked together to strip away the heavy bedding. "Right now her body is too hot. We need to help it cool down." They worked through the night, taking turns bathing Hannah with lukewarm water, encouraging her to sip cool broth and monitoring every breath she took. Silas sent Ben to the barn to check on the animals, partly because the work needed doing, but mostly because the boys' nervous energy was making everyone more anxious. It was near dawn when the fever finally broke. Mabel had dozed off in the chair beside Hannah's bed when she was awakened by a small, weak voice saying her name. "Miss Mabel, I'm thirsty." Mabel's eyes flew open to find Hannah looking at her with clear, alert eyes for the first time in 3 days. The fever flush had faded from her cheeks, leaving her pale but obviously lucid. "Oh, thank God," Mabel breathed, reaching for the cup of water that had been waiting on the bedside table. "Here, sweetheart, drink this slowly." Hannah struggled to sit up, and Mabel helped her, marveling at how much weight the child seemed to have lost in just 3 days. She was thin and fragile, but the dangerous glitter in her eyes was gone, replaced by the natural brightness that was so essentially Hannah. "I had strange dreams," Hannah said after she had drunk half the cup of water. "I dreamed Mama was here, but she looked sad. She kept saying she had to go, but she didn't want to leave us alone." Mabel felt her throat tighten with emotion. "What else did you dream?" "I dreamed you were there too, and you told Mama that we would be all right, that you would take care of us. And then Mama smiled and said she could rest now because she knew we weren't alone anymore." Tears spilled down Mabel's cheeks before she could stop them. "That sounds like a beautiful dream." "It was," Hannah agreed sleepily. "And when I woke up, I felt like Mama had really been here, like she really did know we were going to be all right." From the doorway came the sound of running footsteps, and suddenly the room was full of people. Silas appeared first, his hair disheveled from sleep, followed closely by Sarah, Ben, and Jacob, all of them crowding around the bed with expressions of desperate hope. "Hannah," Jacob cried, climbing onto the bed beside his twin. "You're awake. You're really awake." "Careful," Silas cautioned, but his voice was thick with relief. "She's still weak." "I'm better," Hannah said with a tired smile. "Miss Mabel took care of me. She stayed with me the whole time." Silas's eyes found Mabel's across the room, and the gratitude she saw there was so intense it made her feel dizzy. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't know how to—" "You don't need to thank me," Mabel interrupted. They're all—" She struggled to find words for what these children had come to mean to her. "They're my family too." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and for a moment the room was absolutely silent. Then Sarah stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Mabel's waist in a fierce hug. "Yes," the 12-year-old said with characteristic determination. "You are family. You're our family, and we're yours, and that's just how it is." "That's right," Ben added with the authority of his 14 years. "You're stuck with us now, Miss Mabel, whether you like it or not." "I like it," Mabel managed to say through her tears. "I like it very much." Hannah's recovery was slow but steady, and as the days passed, the entire household seemed to settle into a new rhythm that felt more natural than anything Mabel had ever experienced. She found herself moving through the daily routines with a sense of purpose and belonging that transformed even the most mundane tasks into sources of quiet joy. But their respite from crisis was brief. Just as Hannah was beginning to regain her strength, a new challenge arrived in the form of unexpected visitors. Mabel was in the kitchen teaching Jacob how to knead bread dough without overworking it, when the sound of multiple horses approaching made them both look up from their work. Through the window, she could see 3 men on horseback making their way up the drive, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats, but their posture suggesting this was not a social call. "Papa," Jacob called, abandoning his bread dough to run toward the door. "People are coming." Silas appeared from the direction of the barn, his expression immediately wary as he took in the approaching riders. Even from a distance, Mabel could see the tension in his shoulders as he recognized something about the visitors that she couldn't identify. The 3 men dismounted in the yard, and Mabel felt her stomach drop as she got her first clear look at their faces. The leader was a tall, thin man with a neatly trimmed beard and expensive clothes that marked him as someone of means. The other 2 were clearly hired, muscle-large, rough-looking men who flanked their employer with the casual menace of those accustomed to enforcing other people's will. "Blackwood," the well-dressed man called out as he approached Silas. "I think it's time we had a conversation." "Harrison," Silas replied, his voice carefully neutral. "I wasn't expecting to see you out this way." "I'll bet you weren't," Harrison said with a cold smile, "especially not after the little stunt you pulled in town last month." Mabel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She had heard that name before. Marcus Harrison, one of the wealthiest landowners in the county, a man who was rumored to have his fingers in every profitable enterprise within 50 miles. But what business could he possibly have with Silas? "I don't know what you're talking about," Silas said evenly, but Mabel could see the lie in the tension of his shoulders. "Don't you?" Harrison's smile turned predatory. "Let me refresh your memory. Last month you bid on a certain item at the town auction, $50 if I remember correctly. Quite a generous offer for damaged goods." The blood drained from Mabel's face as she realized what Harrison was talking about. Somehow her purchase for "that's what it had been," no matter how kindly Silas had framed it, had attracted the attention of one of the most powerful men in the territory. "That was a legal transaction," Silas said, his voice gaining an edge of steel. "Witnessed by half the town. I don't see how it concerns you." "Oh, but it does concern me," Harrison replied smoothly. "You see, I had my eye on that particular piece of property. I was planning to make a bid myself, but you moved so quickly that I didn't have the chance." "Then you should have been faster," Silas said flatly. Harrison's laugh was as cold as winter wind. "Should have been faster. Yes, I suppose I should have, but here's the thing. Blackwood, I don't like losing, especially not to backwoods lumberjacks who don't know their place." The insult hung in the air like smoke, acrid and poisonous. Mabel could see Silas's hands clenching into fists at his sides, but his voice remained level when he spoke. "I think this conversation is over, Harrison. I'd appreciate it if you and your men would leave my property." "Not quite yet," Harrison said, gesturing to his companions. "You see, I've been doing some research since that auction. Turns out you've been hiding some interesting secrets, haven't you?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Harrison pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "This is a survey map, Blackwood. Official county records. Very interesting reading if you know what to look for." Silas's face went pale, and Mabel saw something that might have been fear flicker in his eyes. "What do you want, Harrison?" "I want what should have been mine from the beginning," Harrison replied. "That woman, for starters. And I want you to understand that crossing me comes with consequences." "Miss Mabel is not property to be traded or sold," Silas said, his voice rising with anger. "She's a member of my household under my protection, and she's not going anywhere. Your protection? Harrison laughed again. What protection can you offer when you're about to lose everything you own? He unfolded the paper in his hands, holding it up so Silas could see. According to these records, your grandfather never properly filed the deed to the northern section of your land. 200 acres that you've been farming and logging for generations, but that technically still belong to the territorial government. Mabel felt the world tilt around her as she began to understand what Harrison was saying. He was threatening to take away part of Silas's land that had been in his family for generations, land that was essential to their survival. That's impossible, Silas said, but his voice lacked conviction. My grandfather built this place with his own hands. Every acre of it is legally ours. Is it? Harrison folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. I'm afraid the Territorial Land Office disagrees. In fact, they've already begun the process of putting that land up for auction. Guess who's planning to make a bid? The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wind through the trees and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields. Mabel could see Sarah and Ben watching from the porch, their young faces etched with confusion and growing fear. What do you want? Silas asked, finally his voice defeated. I want you to think very carefully about whether one woman is worth losing everything your family has built, Harrison said with satisfaction. I want you to remember that some fights aren't worth having, especially when you're guaranteed to lose. He remounted his horse, his two companions following suit. I'll give you a week to think it over, Blackwood. After that, I file the paperwork to claim that land as abandoned territory, and once I own it, I'll make sure you understand exactly what it means to cross Marcus Harrison. They rode away in a cloud of dust and menace, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to ring in Mabel's ears. She watched Silas standing alone in the yard, his shoulders bowed under the weight of whatever burden Harrison had just placed on them, and felt her heart break all over again. She had found a family, found a place where she belonged, found the first real happiness she had known in years. And now, because of her, it was all going to be destroyed. Miss Mabel. Hannah's voice was small and uncertain behind her. What did that man want? Why did he look so angry? Mabel turned to find all 4 children clustered in the kitchen doorway, their faces reflecting various degrees of confusion and fear. Sarah, as always, was the first to step forward, her 12-year-old shoulders squared with determination. It's about you, isn't it? Sarah said with characteristic directness. That man wants to hurt Papa because he brought you here. Sarah, Ben warned, but the girl ignored him. I'm right, aren't I? Sarah continued, her eyes fixed on Mabel's face. He's angry because Papa wouldn't let him have you at the auction, and now he's trying to punish our whole family. Mabel felt her throat close with emotion. The child's intuition was devastatingly accurate, and there was no point in trying to lie about it. Yes, she said quietly. I think that's exactly what's happening. Then what do we do? Jacob asked, his usual energy subdued by the gravity of the situation. Before Mabel could answer, Silas appeared in the doorway behind the children. His face was drawn with worry, but there was something resolute in his expression that gave her hope. We do what we always do, he said firmly. We face it together as a family, and we figure out how to protect what matters most. But if you lose the land, Mabel began. Then we lose the land, Silas interrupted. Land can be replaced, family cannot. You can't sacrifice everything for me, Mabel protested. I won't let you. Well, you don't have a choice in the matter, Silas said with gentle finality, and neither do I. Harrison thinks he can use fear to break up our family, but he's wrong. We're stronger than he knows. Are we? The question slipped out before Mabel could stop it, carrying all the doubt and fear that had been building in her chest since Harrison's visit. Silas moved to stand directly in front of her, his gray eyes intense as they searched her face. Do you remember what I told you about the bear? He asked softly. Yes, but I told you that I would have fought that bear with my bare hands, If it had been threatening my children, he continued, not because I was brave, but because I had something worth protecting. I remember. Well, now I have something else worth protecting, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I have you, and I'll be damned if I let Marcus Harrison or anyone else take away what we've built here. The words hit Mabel like a physical force, and she felt her knees go weak with the intensity of emotion they stirred up. Here was this man, this good and decent man, willing to risk everything he had built to protect her, not because he needed her services or her labor, but because she had become precious to him. What if it's not enough? She whispered. What if we can't win? Then we'll lose together, Silas said simply. And we'll figure out what comes next together too. That's what families do. From behind them came the sound of Sarah clearing her throat with obvious impatience. Are you two going to stand there talking all day? She asked with characteristic directness. Or are we going to figure out how to fight back? Silas turned to look at his daughter with raised eyebrows. Of course we, Sarah said firmly. This is our family Harrison is threatening. Hannah might be too little to help much, but the rest of us aren't going to just sit here and let him destroy everything we care about. That's right, Ben added, stepping forward with the determined expression of a young man ready to prove himself. Whatever needs doing, we'll do it. Even if it means standing up to the richest, most powerful man in the county, Silas asked. Especially then, Jacob said with surprising maturity. Miss Mabel is family now, and nobody hurts our family. Standing in that kitchen, surrounded by the fierce loyalty of children who had claimed her as their own, and the steady strength of a man who valued her above his own security, Mabel felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. For the first time in her life, she truly understood what it meant to belong somewhere, to be worth fighting for, to be loved not for what she could provide, but for who she was. The road ahead would be difficult, perhaps impossible. Harrison was wealthy and powerful, with connections and resources that dwarfed anything they could bring to bear against him. But as Mabel looked around at the faces of her chosen family, she felt a fierce determination rise up inside her. Let Harrison come. Let him try to tear apart what they had built together. He might have money and influence, but they had something far more powerful. They had love and loyalty, and the unshakable conviction that some things were worth any price to protect. The battle for their future was about to begin, and Mabel intended to fight with everything she had. The first thing Silas did after Harrison's departure was gather the family around the kitchen table with a large wooden box that Mabel had never seen before. His movements were deliberate but urgent as he lifted the heavy lid to reveal stacks of papers, maps, and documents that represented decades of Blackwood family history. Help me find grandfather's original land grant, he said to Ben, who immediately began sorting through the yellowed papers with careful precision. It has to be here somewhere. Every deed, every survey, every legal document related to this property, my father kept meticulous records. Sarah moved to stand behind her father's shoulder, peering at the documents with the intensity of someone far older than her 12 years. What exactly are we looking for? She asked. Proof, Silas said grimly. Proof that Harrison is lying about the northern section. My grandfather didn't just squat on government land. He filed proper claims, paid fees, followed every legal requirement that existed at the time. But what if the papers were lost? Hannah asked from her seat beside Mabel. The little girl was still pale from her recent illness, but her eyes were bright with determination. What if they got burned in a fire or something? Then we find another way, Silas said with quiet conviction. There are always multiple records of land transactions. The territorial office, the county courthouse, the federal land office somewhere. There's documentation that proves our legal claim. Jacob, who had been unusually quiet since Harrison's visit, suddenly spoke up. What if we just gave him what he wants? He asked in a small voice. What if Miss Mabel went away? Would he leave us alone then? The suggestion hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Mabel felt her heart clench as she saw the desperate hope in the 8-year-old's eyes, hope that this nightmare could be ended simply by removing its apparent cause. "Jacob Blackwood," Sarah said with fierce intensity, "don't you dare suggest such a thing. Miss Mabel is family, and we don't abandon family just because things get difficult." "But if it would save Papa's land," Jacob began. "It wouldn't," Silas interrupted firmly. "Harrison isn't really angry about the auction, son. That's just his excuse. He's been wanting to get his hands on our timber rights for years, and this is his opportunity to try." "What do you mean?" Ben asked, looking up from the papers he was examining. Silas pulled out a surveyor's map and spread it across the table. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the boundaries marked in faded ink. "Our northern section borders directly on Harrison's largest holdings. But more importantly, it contains the headwaters of Miller's Creek and controls access to the best timber stands in the entire valley." Mabel studied the map, beginning to understand the true scope of Harrison's ambitions. "So even if I weren't here, he'd find another excuse to challenge your claim to that land." "Exactly. The auction just gave him a convenient pretext and a personal grudge to motivate him." Silas rolled up the map with careful precision. "We're not fighting this battle because of you, Mabel. We're fighting it because Harrison is a greedy man who thinks he can take whatever he wants." "But we are fighting it," Ben said, and there was something adult in his voice that made Mabel's heart to ache for his lost childhood. "Aren't we, Papa? We're not just going to let him steal our land. We're going to fight with every legal means at our disposal," Silas confirmed. "But I need all of you to understand what that means. It's going to be expensive, time-consuming, and there's no guarantee we'll win. Are you prepared for that?" "We're prepared," Sarah said, immediately speaking for all of them with characteristic authority. "Even if it means we might lose everything anyway," Silas pressed. "Even if fighting back just makes Harrison angrier and more determined to destroy us." "Especially then," Hannah said with surprising firmness for such a young child. "Mama always said that right is right even when it's hard." The mention of their mother brought a moment of reverent silence to the kitchen. Then Jacob, his childish voice trembling with emotion, said what they were all thinking. "Mama would want us to fight for our family." "Yes," Silas said softly, "she would." What followed were 3 of the most intense days Mabel had ever experienced. The kitchen table became a command center where papers were sorted, maps were studied, and plans were made with military precision. Silas sent Ben on horseback to the county seat with a list of records to research, while Sarah took charge of organizing their existing documents into chronological order. Mabel found herself assigned the task of writing letters to territorial officials, to other landowners who might have faced similar challenges from Harrison, to anyone who might have information or influence that could help their cause. Her neat handwriting and formal education, once sources of shame in a world that valued practical skills above book learning, suddenly became valuable assets in their fight for survival. "Write to Judge Morrison, too," Silas suggested as he reviewed her latest draft. "He knew my father performed the wedding ceremony when I married Mary. He might be willing to testify about the family's long-standing presence on that land." "What about Pastor Williams?" Hannah asked from her corner, where she was supposedly reading but was actually listening to every word of their strategizing. "He's baptized all of us, and he visits the northern section every year to bless the graves in the family cemetery." "The cemetery," Silas breathed, and suddenly his face lit up with the first real hope Mabel had seen since Harrison's visit. "Hannah, you brilliant child, you may have just saved us." "What do you mean?" Mabel asked. "Burial rights," Silas explained, already moving toward the door. "If we can prove continuous family use of that land for burial purposes, it strengthens our claim significantly. Come on, we need to ride up there before the snow gets too deep." The journey to the northern section took them through some of the most beautiful country Mabel had ever seen. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches heavy with snow that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of evergreen and wood smoke from a distant cabin. But it was the small cemetery that took Mabel's breath away. Nestled in a grove of massive oak trees, it was clearly a place that had been tended with love for generations. The headstones were simple but well maintained, and someone had recently cleared away the fallen leaves to reveal the carved names and dates that told the story of the Blackwood family's presence in this valley. "There's my grandfather, Thomas Blackwood," Silas said, kneeling beside a weathered stone marker. "Born 1801, died 1867. He cleared this land with his own hands, built the first cabin, planted the first crops. And here's your grandmother," Mabel added, reading from an adjacent stone. "Margaret Blackwood, beloved wife and mother. She must have been very young when she died." "Childbirth," Silas said quietly. "My father was only 10 years old when she passed. Grandfather raised him alone, just like I'm raising my children." They spent an hour documenting every grave, copying down names and dates, taking careful note of the dates that proved continuous family presence on the land for over 60 years. As they worked, Mabel found herself thinking about the generations of Blackwoods who had lived and died on this land, who had invested their blood and sweat and dreams in making it home. "Silas," she said, suddenly struck by a thought that made her stomach clench with guilt. "What if I left voluntarily? Not because Harrison demanded it, but because I chose to. Would that help your case?" He looked up from the headstone. He was examining, his gray eyes fierce with emotion. "Don't," he said simply. "But if my presence here is what's driving Harrison's vendetta, Mabel." He stood and moved to face her directly, his hands coming up to rest gently on her shoulders. "Do you remember what I told you about the bear?" "Yes, but I told you that I would fight that bear to protect my children. What I didn't tell you is that it wouldn't matter if the bear was bigger than me, stronger than me, more likely to win. I would still fight because some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds." "This is different," Mabel protested. "Your children are—" "My children love you," Silas interrupted. "They've claimed you as family, and so have I. You're not a burden we're protecting out of duty. You're someone we're fighting for because losing you would break our hearts." The simple honesty of his words left Mabel speechless. She had spent so many years believing that her worth was tied to what she could provide, what function she could serve, that the idea of being valued simply for herself was almost incomprehensible. "Besides," Silas continued with a slight smile, "running away wouldn't solve anything. Harrison wants this land and he'll take it regardless of whether you're here or not. At least this way, we get to fight back with a full family supporting us." That evening they returned to the cabin with documented proof of the family cemetery and a renewed sense of purpose. Ben had returned from his trip to the county seat. With mixed news, some records supported their claim, but others were mysteriously missing from the files. "The clerk said there was a break-in last month," Ben reported as they gathered around the kitchen table. "Someone went through the land records and made off with several boxes of documents. Funny thing is, they only took papers related to properties in our area." "Harrison's work," Silas said grimly. "He's been planning this for longer than we thought." "So what do we do now?" Sarah asked. "Now we go to town," Silas said with determination. "We file our own claim, we present our evidence to Judge Morrison, and we make sure everyone in the county knows exactly what Harrison is trying to do." The trip to Cedar Falls the next morning was tense with anticipation. Mabel sat beside Silas on the wagon seat, acutely aware that this might be her last visit to the town where her humiliation had begun only 2 months earlier. If they lost this fight, they would lose everything, not just the land, but their home, their livelihood, their future together. "Are you ready for this?" Silas asked quietly as they approached the outskirts of town. "I'm ready," Mabel replied, and was surprised to find that she meant it. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, she would face it standing beside the family that had claimed her as their own. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. Word having spread quickly through the small community, about the legal challenge to the Blackwood land claim. Judge Morrison, an elderly man with kind eyes and silver hair, listened gravely as Silas presented their evidence, and Harrison's lawyer argued for immediate seizure of the disputed property. "Your Honor," Harrison's lawyer said with oily confidence, "the territorial records clearly show that the northern section of the Blackwood property was never properly deeded. My client is simply seeking to claim abandoned land that has reverted to government ownership." "Abandoned," Silas stood, his voice ringing with indignation. "Your Honor, my family has been buried in that soil for 3 generations. We've farmed it, logged it, and maintained a family cemetery there for over 60 years. How can land with active graves be considered abandoned?" The lawyer waved dismissively. "Burial sites don't constitute legal ownership, Your Honor, without proper deeds and surveys." "I have proper deeds and surveys," Silas interrupted, producing the documents they had found in his father's papers. "Filed in 1849 with the Territorial Land Office, witnessed and notarized according to the laws of the time." The lawyer's confidence faltered slightly as he examined the papers. "These documents appear to be irregularly filed, Your Honor. The Territorial Office has no record of—" "Because someone stole the territorial records." Ben spoke up from his seat in the gallery, his young voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "The county clerk told me himself that someone broke into the land office last month and took all the files related to our area." A murmur ran through the crowd at this revelation. Judge Morrison leaned forward, his expression stern, as he addressed Harrison's lawyer. "Are you saying that your client's claim is based on the absence of records that may have been illegally removed?" "I'm saying that absent proper documentation, I have documentation." The voice came from the back of the courtroom, and everyone turned to see a small, elderly woman making her way slowly toward the front. Mabel recognized her as Mrs. Patterson, the widow who lived near town and always had too many kittens to give away. "Mrs. Patterson," Judge Morrison said with obvious respect, "do you have something to add to these proceedings?" "I certainly do," the old woman said with surprising firmness. "I was Martha Patterson's daughter-in-law before I was widowed, and Martha Patterson was present when Thomas Blackwood first filed his claim to that land in 1849. She kept a diary, Your Honor, and I still have it." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs as Mrs. Patterson produced a small leather-bound book from her handbag. "Every land transaction, every birth, every death, every major event in this county for 40 years, Martha wrote it all down, including the exact date and details of Thomas Blackwood's land claim." Harrison's lawyer looked genuinely shaken as Mrs. Patterson handed the diary to Judge Morrison. "Your Honor, this is inadmissible hearsay. This is contemporary documentation by a respected member of the community," the judge corrected firmly. "Mrs. Patterson, would you be willing to testify under oath about the contents of this diary?" "I'd be delighted to," the elderly woman said with obvious satisfaction, "especially since it proves that Mr. Harrison's grandfather tried to challenge Thomas Blackwood's claim back in 1852 and was told by the territorial governor himself to stop harassing honest settlers." The effect of this revelation was immediate and dramatic. Harrison, who had been sitting with smug confidence throughout the proceedings, went pale as the implications sank in. His lawyer began frantically shuffling through papers, clearly trying to find some way to salvage their case. Judge Morrison spent several minutes reading through the relevant entries in Martha Patterson's diary, his expression growing more stern with each page. Finally, he looked up and addressed the courtroom with grave authority. "Based on the evidence presented today, I find that the Blackwood family has maintained continuous and legal ownership of the disputed property for over 60 years. Mr. Harrison's claim is denied, and any attempt to interfere with the Blackwood family's peaceful enjoyment of their property will be considered harassment under territorial law." The courtroom exploded in cheers and applause as the judge's gavel fell with finality. Mabel felt Silas's strong hand grasp hers, his fingers intertwining with hers as they shared a moment of profound relief and joy. But their celebration was short-lived. As they made their way out of the courthouse, Harrison himself intercepted them on the steps, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he snarled. "You may have won this round, but I have other ways of dealing with people who cross me." "Is that a threat, Harrison?" Silas asked calmly, though Mabel could feel the tension radiating from his body. "It's a promise," Harrison replied. "You think your little family is safe just because you won in court. You have no idea what I'm capable of. And you have no idea what you're dealing with." Sarah's voice rang out as she stepped between the two men, her 12-year-old frame dwarfed by their bulk, but her spirit undaunted. "You tried to steal our land, and you failed. You tried to break up our family, and you failed. What makes you think we're afraid of anything else you might try?" Harrison's face darkened further as he looked down at the defiant child. "Little girls should be seen and not heard," he said with cold menace. "And grown men should learn to lose gracefully." Sarah shot back without flinching. For a moment, Mabel thought Harrison might actually strike the child. His hand began to rise, his face contorting with fury, but before he could complete the motion, Silas stepped forward with deadly calm. "If you so much as think about laying a hand on my daughter," he said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried the force of an avalanche, "I will personally make sure you regret it for the rest of your very short life." Harrison's hand dropped to his side, but the hatred in his eyes burned brighter than ever. "We'll see how brave you all are when winter really sets in," he said. "We'll see how long your little family stays together when the money runs out and the food gets scarce." With that ominous parting shot, he stalked away toward his expensive carriage, leaving the Blackwood family standing together on the courthouse steps in the weak autumn sunlight. "Is he going to try to hurt us?" Hannah asked in a small voice, pressing close to Mabel's side. "He can try," Silas said with quiet confidence, "but he won't succeed. We've got something he'll never understand. We've got each other, and that makes us stronger than any one man, no matter how wealthy or powerful he thinks he is." As they climbed back into their wagon for the journey home, Mabel felt a profound sense of completion settle over her. The legal battle was won, but more importantly, the emotional battle was won as well. She was no longer the broken woman who had stood on an auction platform 2 months ago, convinced of her own worthlessness. She was part of a family that had fought for her, claimed her, defended her right to belong. "Thank you," she said quietly to Silas as they drove through the gathering dusk toward home. "For what? For seeing something in me worth fighting for." Silas reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her palm. "Thank you," he replied, "for being exactly who you are. Not what someone else wanted you to be, not what the world said you should be, but exactly who you are." Behind them, in the wagon bed, the children chattered excitedly about the day's events, their voices bright with relief and triumph. But it was Hannah's voice that carried most clearly over the sound of the wheels on the road. "Miss Mabel," she said with the profound wisdom that sometimes comes from the mouths of 8-year-olds, "I think you're the best thing that ever happened to our family." "Even better than Christmas morning?" Jacob asked with serious consideration. "Even better than Christmas morning," Hannah confirmed solemnly. As they crested the hill that brought their cabin into view, smoke rising from the chimney in a welcoming plume against the darkening sky, Mabel felt tears of gratitude slip down her cheeks. She had found her home at last, not a place, but a group of people who had chosen to love her, not in spite of her supposed failings, but because of the woman those experiences had shaped her to become. The road ahead would still have challenges, she knew. Harrison's threats weren't idle, and winter would bring its own hardships, but they would face whatever came together as a family, and that made all the difference in the world. "Welcome home," Silas said softly as they pulled into the yard, and Mabel realized that for the first time in her life, she truly understood what those words meant. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly where she belonged. And that was worth more than all the land or money or power that men like Harrison could ever accumulate, because it was built on something no one could steal or destroy, the unshakable foundation of hearts that had chosen to bind themselves together in love.